AD 40. In a Roman workshop, hammers strike sheets of gold. The order from the emperor is precise. Build a colossus. Plate it in gold. Ship it east. Its destination is a curtained room inside the Temple of Jerusalem, the Holy of Holies, where no statue has ever stood, and no foreign god has ever been named. This was not a request for worship. It was an eviction. Gaius Caesar Germanicus, the man Rome called Caligula, intended to walk into the house of the God of Abraham and take the throne. A gilded face where there had been only silence. A new tenant in heaven. But the man who tried to conquer a god was not born on a throne. He was born in a tent. Picture a boy of 3 on the floor of a military camp in Germania. Mud on the leather. Wine on the breath of soldiers who no longer obey. His father commands these legions, and these legions are in revolt. The child watches grown men he knows by name turn feral within a single night. He hears the shouting, he smells the smoke, and somewhere inside that small skull, a calculation begins that will never stop running. The world is a knife. You hold it, or you kneel for it. This is not the story of an emperor who lost his mind. His mind worked perfectly. This is the story of a child who studied cruelty up close and decided, with cold arithmetic, that the only escape from being a victim was to stop being human. Over the next minutes, you will watch absolute power land in the hands of a predator. You will see Roman religion bent into a private cult, Roman law twisted into a personal weapon, Roman society reshaped into an altar with one name carved on it, his own. You will learn the rites of this new faith. They were not incense and prayer. They were fear, humiliation, and bodies. This is not a descent into madness. This is a climb into something worse. Before we step inside that tent, tell us in the comments which city and country you are watching from. If these journeys into the dark corners of the past mean something to you, subscribe. It is the single strongest way to keep this work alive. You're watching Romanus, your home of the Roman Empire on YouTube. Capri sits in the Tyrrhenian Sea like a clenched stone fist. No beach, no gentle approach. Cliffs of white limestone that drop 200 meters straight into salt water. The rock face streaked with the droppings of seabirds, and the green of stubborn shrubs that cling where nothing should grow. The only landing is a narrow cove on the eastern side, where a single boat at a time can be hauled in and unloaded under the eyes of guards posted on the heights above. In AD 27, the Emperor Tiberius loaded his court, his appetites, and his suspicions onto ships and sailed for that island. He was 67 years old. He never came back. For 11 years, he ran the largest empire on Earth from a clifftop villa called the Villa Jovis, the Villa of Jupiter, staffed by astrologers, informers, Greek physicians, and the slow cruelty of an old man who had stopped pretending to care what Rome thought of him. Tacitus describes the place with disgust. 12 villas dotted the island, each named for a different god, each fitted out for a different appetite. There was a cliff on the northern edge called the Salto di Tiberio, the Leap of Tiberius, from which men accused of treason were thrown into the sea while sailors waited below in skiffs with boat hooks to finish anything still breathing when it hit the water. In AD 31, a boy stepped off a ship onto that rock. He was 18. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. He had been summoned from the household of his great-grandmother Livia, the widow of Augustus, where he had been kept under careful supervision since the destruction of his immediate family. He carried no faction, no allies, no protection. Only the blood in his veins and a face that reminded the old emperor of a dead man Tiberius had once loved and then ground into the earth. His father, Germanicus, the most celebrated Roman general of his generation, had died at Antioch in AD 19, vomiting and accusing Piso, the governor of Syria, of poisoning him on imperial orders. The investigation closed nothing. Piso was found dead in his own house, throat opened, before the trial concluded. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, granddaughter of Augustus, had been arrested in AD 29 and exiled to the island of Pandataria, a flat rock west of Naples used by the Julio-Claudians as a women's prison. She was on a hunger strike. Tiberius had ordered a centurion to beat her so badly she lost an eye. She would die in AD 33, refusing food, her face mutilated, her teeth knocked out, her body finally pitched into a hasty grave on the island. 2 of his brothers were already dead. Nero Caesar had been declared a public enemy in AD 29 and exiled to Pontia, where he was either driven to suicide or quietly executed in AD 31. The same year Gaius landed on Capri. Drusus Caesar had been locked in a cell beneath the Palatine in Rome. He would die there in AD 33, the records noting that he had survived 9 days by chewing the stuffing of his mattress before starvation finished him. The third brother, Tiberius Gemellus, was Tiberius's own grandson and only a small boy. Gaius arrived on Capri with nothing he could afford to show on his face. So he smiled, he bowed, he praised the old man who had crushed his family one body at a time. He slept in the same hilltop complex as the creature who had reduced his mother to bones. And he said nothing. He said nothing for 6 years. Suetonius records the detail that stuck in the older sources. Even when the news of his mother's death and his brother's deaths reached the island, Gaius's expression did not shift. He continued to attend dinners. He continued to compliment Tiberius's verses. He performed the part of the grateful ward with such precision that Tiberius, a man who had survived 40 years of senatorial blades and slow poisons, who trusted no living person, was reportedly heard to say that Gaius was the luckiest man alive. Then Tiberius said something else. Suetonius preserves the line. He said he was rearing a viper for the Roman people and a Phaethon for the world. Phaethon, the boy in the old Greek story who climbed into the chariot of the sun and burned the earth before falling out of the sky. The old emperor saw the thing under the mask. He just believed he would be dead before it stepped out. He was right, by 4 years. What Gaius absorbed on Capri was not madness. Madness is wild and undirected. What he absorbed was a curriculum. He stood at the edge of every audience chamber in the Villa Jovis and watched Tiberius operate at the summit of Roman power, with the quiet, hungry attention of a boy who had learned to survive by waiting. He watched the prefect Sejanus, who had been Tiberius's right hand for a decade, dismantled in a single morning in AD 31. A letter read aloud in the Senate, the Praetorians turning on him before he could finish standing. His body dragged down the Gemonian stairs by hooks. His children executed days later. His small daughter raped by the executioner first, because Roman law forbade the strangulation of a virgin. Gaius watched the lesson. Sejanus had served loyally. Sejanus had been indispensable. Sejanus had died screaming anyway, on the whim of the man on the cliff. The curriculum continued. Every senator who climbed the path to the villa came on his knees. Every name added to the maestas lists vanished without a trial worth the name. Every verdict was decided before the accusation was read aloud. Cassius Dio describes the period flatly. Informers grew rich. Slaves were tortured for testimony against their masters. Wills were rewritten under duress, then validated by courts that knew the source of the duress. Each of these scenes was a chisel stroke on a young mind with nothing left to lose. He watched men whose ancestors had founded the Republic crawl in front of an old recluse who had not left an island in a decade. He watched dignity dissolve in the room where it had been invented. He did not turn away from it. He took notes. In the early hours of March 16, AD 37, Tiberius died at Misenum on the Bay of Naples, at the villa of Lucullus, having left Capri only because the weather and his health forced him onto the mainland. The story of how is worth pausing on. Tacitus and Suetonius both preserve versions. The old man had collapsed and been declared dead. His signet ring had been pulled from his finger. Gaius had already stepped outside to receive the acclamations of the household. Then a slave came running. Tiberius had stirred. He had opened his eyes. He had asked for food. And the Praetorian prefect Macro, who had inherited Sejanus's post and Sejanus's lessons, walked back into the bedchamber. He pressed a heap of bedclothes down over the emperor's face. He held it. Suetonius writes that Caligula stood close enough to witness it. He was 24 years old. Whether his hand was on the linen or only his eyes on the room, the outcome was identical. The eyes that had seen through him for 6 years were closed. The news reached Rome within 2 days. The city broke open in a celebration so naked it tells you everything about what Tiberius's reign had felt like from inside its walls. Crowds flooded the forum. Some shouted, "Tiberium in Tiberim! Tiberius into the Tiber!" demanding that his corpse be dragged through the streets and dumped into the river like the body of a common criminal. Sacrifices smoked at every altar from the Capitoline to the Aventine. The name Caligula, Little Boots, the nickname the legions of the Rhine had stuck on him as a toddler when his mother Agrippina paraded him through the camps of his father in a miniature soldier's kit, rang through the streets like the name of a deliverer. The Senate, under the presidency of the consul Gnaeus Acerronius, met on March 18th and granted him every power Tiberius had ever held. No negotiation, no conditions. They voted aside Tiberius's will, which had named Gaius and the young Gemellus as joint heirs, and gave Caligula the principate alone. They did not even wait for him to ask. He entered Rome on March 28th. The body of Tiberius came with him, escorted under armed guard to keep the mob from tearing it apart in the streets. Caligula delivered the funeral oration himself, weeping for a man he had watched smothered. Then he sailed to the Palatine Islands. He gathered the ashes and bones of his mother and his brother Nero from their unmarked graves on Pandataria and Pontia, brought them home in his own arms, and interred them in the mausoleum of Augustus on the Campus Martius. A vast crowd watched. He paid for new coins to be struck bearing his mother's face. The propaganda was perfect. He was the son restoring his murdered family. He was the new beginning. For 8 months, he was magnificent. He brought home the exiles. He opened the prisons. He hauled out the treason files Tiberius had compiled, the dossiers that had killed senators by the dozens, and burned them in the Forum, hurling the documents into a brazier while the Curia watched, swearing publicly that he had not read a single page. He abolished the Maestas trials. He raised the legionaries' pay and distributed a cash bonus of 300 sesterces to every citizen on the grain dole. He held elections by popular vote for the first time since Augustus had suspended them. He staged games on a scale Rome had not seen in a generation. Suetonius lists them. Games for his mother. Games for his father. Games for Augustus. Games for the dedication of the Temple of Augustus, which Tiberius had left half-finished for 20 years. He gave the mob blood in the sand, and the elite the flattery of being consulted again. Rome loved him. Philo of Alexandria, the Jewish philosopher who would later have personal cause to hate him, wrote that in those first months it seemed the human race had been blessed with a new beginning. Then, in October of AD 37, he fell ill. The nature of the sickness is still argued. Suetonius mentions a brain fever. Philo describes a collapse that lasted weeks. What is not argued is how close to dead he came. Rome stopped breathing. Citizens slept on the steps of the temples. Some publicly offered their own lives to the gods in exchange for his. A man named Publius Afranius Potitus swore in the Forum that he would die if the emperor recovered. Another, Atenius Secundus, vowed to fight in the arena. Temples filled with smoke and shouted prayers around the clock. He recovered. He walked out of that bedroom a different creature. His first act on his feet was to summon the two men who had sworn their lives. Afranius Potitus was driven through the streets crowned with garlands and pushed off the Tarpeian rock. Atenius Secundus was thrown into the arena and forced to keep his oath at the point of a gladius. They had promised. He held them to it. Nearly every ancient source treats this illness as the hinge. The thoughtful young reformer entered the fever. Something else came out of it. Modern doctors propose theories. Epilepsy, which Suetonius says he had suffered from since childhood. Hyperthyroidism, lead from the water pipes. The slow collapse of a man who had worn a survival mask for 6 years, and finally, in a room where no one was watching, stopped holding it up. There is another way to read what happened. The mortal Gaius Germanicus went into that fever. He came out convinced he had died and returned. He had crossed the line that ends every other human story and walked back across it. The gods had looked at him and sent him back. From that moment forward, the rules that governed men did not apply to him. He had received an exemption written in heaven. The first signs showed in how he handled the survivors of his own family. His grandmother Antonia, daughter of Mark Antony, the woman who had exposed the Sejanus conspiracy to Tiberius and held the Julio-Claudian line together through every purge, died on May 1st, AD 37, possibly by her own hand, after Caligula refused her a private audience. He did not attend her funeral. He watched the pyre from a dining couch on the Palatine. His cousin Tiberius Gemellus, the boy who had been his co-heir under Tiberius's discarded will, was adopted by Caligula and given the title Princeps Juventutis, Prince of Youth. Within months, he was charged with plotting against the emperor and ordered to kill himself. A tribune was sent. The boy did not know how. The tribune had to show him where to place the sword. His uncle Claudius, stammering, dragging one leg, the household joke for decades, he kept close, but only as a prop, a buffoon at the table, a man whose presence made the emperor look brighter by contrast. Suetonius records that the courtiers threw olive stones at him during dinner, and that he was made to stand for hours in the sun while Caligula laughed. Then there was Drusilla. She was the middle of his 3 surviving sisters, born in AD 16, married in AD 33 to a man named Lucius Cassius Longinus, and then in AD 37 stripped from that marriage by her brother and handed to one of his closest companions, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, who was understood to be sleeping with Caligula as well. Suetonius, writing 2 generations later, sets down the rest plainly. Caligula had taken all 3 of his sisters. He had taken Drusilla first, when their grandmother Antonia had walked in on them as children, and the household had been forced to look the other way. And of every human being on earth, she was the one person he allowed inside the locked room of himself. When he fell sick in October of AD 37, he named her in his will. Not just heir to his property, heir to the empire, a woman, named as successor to the throne of Rome. There was no precedent for it. There had never been one. On June 10th, AD 38, Drusilla died. She was 22. The cause is not recorded. His grief did not stay inside him. It did not stay inside the palace. He refused to touch her body. He could not be present at the funeral. He left Rome the night she died, riding south without a destination, and was found days later in Sicily, sitting in the harbor at Syracuse, with his hair and beard grown wild, refusing to bathe, refusing to speak. When he returned to Rome, he passed laws, actual statutes, with penalties attached, forbidding laughter in public, forbidding bathing, forbidding family meals during the official period of mourning. A senator was prosecuted for having sold hot water during the days of grief. A man was executed for having laughed at his mother's tomb. A whole city was forced to wear his sorrow on its body. Then he did something Rome had never seen. He made the Senate declare her a goddess. Diva Drusilla, Panthea. The divine Drusilla, identified with every goddess in the pantheon at once. A temple was decreed. 20 priests were appointed, men and women in equal number. Her statue was placed in the Temple of Venus in the Forum, to be worshipped with the same rites as the goddess of love. Her birthday was added to the religious calendar with games attached. A senator named Livius Geminius came forward and swore under oath, on penalty of his own life and the lives of his children, that he had personally seen Drusilla ascend into heaven and speak with the gods. He was paid 1,000,000 sesterces for the testimony. An oath was sworn in her name in every public office. To refuse it was to invite the kind of attention that had recently emptied senatorial houses across the city. Look at what he had just accomplished. He had taken a dead woman with no military career, no political record, no mythological lineage, and he had manufactured a deity out of her by signing a document. He had ordered the Senate of Rome, the institutional memory of 5 centuries of tradition, to ratify the divinity of his sister. And the Senate had done it within the hour. No real debate, no resistance worth the name. This was not mourning. This was a rehearsal. He had just proven to himself and to his court that the wall between human and divine was not built of stone. It was built of paper. Divinity was not bestowed by the gods on the deserving. It was a designation issued by power, enforced by law, and accepted by frightened men in striped togas. If he could turn Drusilla into a goddess with a wax tablet, he could turn himself into one with the next. The money he spent that year reflected exactly that conviction. He spent like a god, without arithmetic, without horizon. Suetonius gives the figure. Tiberius had left 2,700 million sesterces in the treasury at his death. Within 12 months, Caligula had burned through it. The games he staged were not entertainment. They were liturgy. He imported giraffes from Africa, bears from Germania, big cats from Numidia. He ran beast hunts, gladiator pairs, plays, and chariot races on the same afternoon. Cassius Dio records that he ordered the construction of a bridge of boats across the Bay of Naples, 3.5 miles long, lashed together from every cargo ship that could be requisitioned from Ostia and Misenum, a project that left Rome short of grain for weeks. He rode across it on horseback in the breastplate of Alexander the Great, which he had ordered removed from Alexander's tomb in Egypt and shipped to Italy for the occasion. A soothsayer named Thrasyllus had once told Tiberius that Caligula had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding on horseback across the Gulf of Baiae. The bridge was the answer to a dead man's joke. The torches came next. He reportedly lit the circus after sundown using condemned men, sewn into oiled animal hides, set alight and hoisted on poles as human lamps. The treasury officers paled and said nothing. When the gold ran low, he did not slow down. He found new veins. The treason files he had burned so theatrically 2 years earlier? He had read every page first. Copies had been made before the public burning. Every accusation, every informant's whisper, every wealthy name. He remembered all of it. The Maestas trials he had abolished in his first months were quietly restored. Charges were drawn from laws whose meaning shifted between morning and afternoon. Estates were confiscated because the deceased had failed to name the emperor in his will. Rich men were accused of plots they had never imagined and offered the chance to buy mercy. The mercy often did not arrive. A senator named Junius Priscus was charged with a capital crime. Under pressure, he confessed. Caligula then informed him, in front of the court, that he had confessed to something he had not done, that a man of his rank should have died silent rather than invent a guilt to escape pain. And then Caligula executed him anyway. The reasoning, he explained, was sound. A man who would lie to save his own life had already proven his character was worthless. A wealthy provincial named Gnaeus Domitius Afer, one of the great orators of the age, delivered a speech praising the emperor so extravagantly that Caligula, who fancied himself the better speaker, took it as an insult to his rhetoric. Afer survived only by falling to his knees in the Senate and declaring that he feared the emperor's eloquence more than his power. The logic worked perfectly from inside the new theology. Guilt was no longer a fact about a person. Guilt was a designation that fell on whoever the god decided to mark. The estate flowed back to the treasury. The treasury flowed back into the games, the temples, the construction, and the slow build of a religion being assembled body by body. That religion needed walls. In AD 39, he gave it walls. He ordered a covered passage built from the imperial residence on the Palatine down across the Forum and directly into the Temple of Castor and Pollux. The temple stood at the southeastern edge of the Forum, built originally to honor the divine twins who had appeared in the Forum after the Battle of Lake Regillus in 496 BC to water their horses and bring news of victory. It was one of the oldest cult sites in Rome. He had the bronze doors at the rear of the cella removed. He cut a doorway through the back wall of the sanctuary so that he could walk directly from the Palatine into the holiest interior of the temple without ever setting foot in the Forum. Suetonius preserves the phrase he used. He had made Castor and Pollux his doorkeepers. He stationed himself between the two ancient statues of the divine twins, the marble riders, white in the gloom of the temple, with their horses' bridles still glinting from old bronze fittings, and from that throne he received petitioners, not as an emperor, as a third figure in a triad. He charged fees. Worshippers paid for the privilege of asking the god seated between Castor and Pollux for favors. Senators climbed the steps. They bowed to the marble twins and to the living man between them with the same depth of bow, because the recent history of Junius Priscus had made the price of insufficient reverence painfully easy to calculate. He dressed for the role. Some days he wore the golden beard and lightning bolt of Jupiter. Some days the helmet and spear of Mars. Some days the women's robes of Venus. He had ordered the heads of the great cult statues of Greece, the Zeus of Olympia, the Hera of Argos, to be shipped to Rome so their faces could be removed and replaced with his own. The order went out. The ships were prepared. Only the resistance of the engineers, who reported the statues would crack in transit, delayed the work. He had taken one of the holiest public spaces in Rome and converted it into his shrine. He was no longer ruling. He was being worshipped. Before we step into the deeper rites of this religion, and they get worse, much worse, very quickly, There is something I have to ask of you. A production at this depth is built by hands you do not see. Research, sources, scripting, voice, editing. It runs on the loyalty of a small inner circle. If you believe Roman history deserves to be told at this level, with this refusal to soften the truth, then consider joining the Praetorian Guard. That is the channel's sworn membership. The guard that keeps the emperor's work standing. Members get episodes before the public. Their support is what allows the standard you are watching to exist. The link is in the description below. If you are loyal to what is being built here, take your post on the wall. Rome is not constructed by spectators. By the spring of AD 40, the framework was finished. He had a resurrection. He had a goddess he had personally made from a corpse. He had erased the wall between the human and the divine and installed himself in the breach. He had shown the Senate they would ratify any theology he wrote, because the Senate was, in the last analysis, a room full of men who very much wanted to keep breathing. The architecture was complete. The doctrine was written. The temple was open. All that remained was the worship itself. And worship, in the religion he had built, was not a matter of incense and song. It was a matter of bodies, of obedience down to the marrow, of acts the human mind reaches for and then pulls back from. And the first congregation was already inside the palace, waiting upstairs in a dining hall where the lamps had just been lit, to be told what their God required of them tonight. The first invitation to dine with the emperor was an honor. The second was a duty. By the third, every man in Rome with rank enough to receive one had learned that the polite, regretful, no-Roman aristocrats had been training their tongues to produce since the cradle, was not a word the Latin language still contained for him. The dining hall on the Palatine had been redesigned to argue a point. The walls were faced with marbles cut from quarries Augustus had only sampled, green serpentine from the Peloponnese, yellow Numidian from the hills above Cimithus, red porphyry shipped down the Nile from the eastern desert, at a cost that had bankrupted 3 procurators. The couches were dressed in Tyrian purple, the dye drawn from the murex sea snail off the coast of Phoenicia at Tyre and Sidon, 6,000 crushed shells to fill a single thimble, sold by weight against gold and losing the contest. The silver came from Etruscan tombs Tiberius had ordered, opened at Tarquinia and Cerveteri. The wine was Falernian from the slopes of Mount Massico in Campania, vintages laid down in the consulship of Opimius in 121 BC, still drinking heavy and resinous at 160 years of age. The cups, Suetonius notes, had passed through the hands of Augustus before they passed through the hands of the men reclining at the table tonight. Servants moved in the soft-footed silence of household slaves, who had learned that being seen by the emperor was an event from which one did not always return. The cooks were Greeks from Antioch, brought in by Mark Antony's daughter Antonia, and never released back to the open market. The pantry slaves were Syrians. The wine pourers were boys from Bithynia, chosen by the emperor's freedman Helicon, the Egyptian who had attached himself to Caligula on Capri and now ran the inner household. The food was magnificent. Flamingo tongues, sow's udder stuffed with sea urchins, murene from the imperial fish ponds at Bauli, fed on the flesh of slaves according to a rumor the senators had stopped trying to disprove. The musicians played softly, Alexandrian flutes paired with a Spanish dancer named Menester, whose performances the emperor would later watch from a private box, and whose throat the emperor would later kiss in public to make a point. The lamps were oil scented with cinnamon brought up the Red Sea coast by Arab merchants from the kingdom of the Sabaeans, who had no idea their cargo was being burned to perfume a slaughter at a table 2,000 miles away. and the men at the table ate the way a hostage eats, slowly, watching the room. What he had built in those rooms was not just cruelty made comfortable. It was a rite. Every part of a Roman religious ceremony had been transcribed into flesh. The host stood in the place of the officiating priest, or rather, the place of the god being served. The diners stood in for the congregation, and the sacrament, the act that consecrated the gathering and proved to every body in the room that no body in the room belonged to itself, was the choosing of a wife. A senator arrived with his spouse on his arm. He had bathed at the baths of Agrippa that afternoon. He had dressed with the careful blandness of a man trying not to attract weather. She had dressed more carefully still. Both of them had rehearsed in the litter on the way over the soft phrases of gratitude that had kept their house standing through the previous months. They took their places. They reclined on the left elbow as Roman custom required. They ate, and at some moment of the evening, the emperor would look across the room. He might say nothing. He might lean across to the husband and remark, in the conversational voice a man uses to compliment a friend's vineyard, that the wife was an interesting woman. Or he might stand without speaking, walk the length of the triclinium past the marble fountain at its center, and lead her out by the wrist through a curtained doorway into the inner rooms of the palace. Suetonius names the women. He names Livia Orestilla, who was led from her own wedding feast in AD 37, her actual wedding, to a young senator named Gaius Calpurnius Piso, and taken to the palace as the emperor's wife of 2 months before being divorced and exiled. He names Lolia Paulina, summoned from her marriage to the governor of a province, because Caligula's grandmother had once mentioned that Lolia's grandmother had been beautiful. He names Cisonia, neither young nor beautiful by the standards of the court, but pregnant with another man's child when Caligula married her and openly devoted to him in a way the others had not been allowed to be. The husbands did not stand. The husband who had stood at an earlier banquet was not on tonight's list. His name was not discussed. His couch had been filled by someone else. Caligula brought the woman back. He returned her to her place beside her husband. And then, while the dishes were being changed and the next course was being laid, he provided a review. Suetonius records it without flinching. The emperor would discuss the wife's body, her conduct, her merits, and her faults, with the bored expertise of an augur evaluating the entrails of a sacrifice. He delivered these notes to the husband. At the table, in front of the husband's colleagues, the husband listened. If the husband had understood his situation properly, he smiled. If he had not yet understood it, he turned the color of bone and learned tonight. This was not cruelty for sport, though it was that as well. It was theology made flesh, the most archaic conception of divine kingship. The god-king whose dominion runs through the bodies of his subjects as completely as it runs through their land and their grain, was being staged in real time at a dinner table on the Palatine. He did not take these women because he wanted them. He took them because taking them, and narrating the taking, was the cleanest possible demonstration of what divinity meant in his system. It meant nobody anywhere in the empire was past his reach. Not a child's, not a wife's, not the body of the man holding the wine cup. The senators who left those banquets walked home through the dark streets of the Palatine, past the torches of the vigiles, carrying something Roman men of their class had been raised never to carry. The certainty that their honor was not theirs to defend. It had been placed in the keeping of the god, and the god had already shown what he thought of it. The banquets were the public face. The deeper sacrament happened elsewhere. Cassius Dio places it on the upper floor of the palace itself. Suetonius places it in a hall set aside and converted into something for which no Roman word existed cleanly. Both call it a brothel. Both describe it with an almost audible disgust. The women on the inside were not slaves. They were not professionals. They were not the freedwomen who staffed the legal lupanaria in the Subura, where the murals of acts performed for 2 asses an hour were still being repainted by the same workshops that decorated the back alleys of Pompeii. They were the wives and daughters of the senatorial families whose names had been carved into the front of the Forum's monuments since the Punic Wars. The clients on the outside were equestrians, magistrates, financiers, men of the second tier of Rome who, under Augustus, would not have been permitted in the same room as the matrons whose hands they were now buying by the hour. There was an attendant who calculated the fees. There was a clerk who kept the books. The receipts were tallied at the end of each evening and entered into the imperial accounts under a heading Suetonius does not preserve, but the existence of which he confirms. The fees were substantial. The fees were the point. Caligula had not built a brothel. In his theology, he had built a temple. The coins were not payment for service. They were offerings made at an altar. The women were not the assaulted. They were sacred property of the god, loaned out as a privilege to supplicants who had demonstrated devotion in the only currency the god currently accepted. This is the thread to hold. Across every act of his reign, he was not improvising. He was building a coherent religion and forcing the civilization underneath him to ratify it. The 2 pillars of Roman aristocratic identity, the domus, the household as a sacred and inviolate unit guarded by the household gods, the lares and penates, whose small bronze statues stood in the niche of every atrium, and dignitas, the honor a man accumulated and passed to his sons through the wax masks of the ancestors displayed in the same atrium during funerals, were not being attacked at random. They were being replaced. The old religion of Roman virtue, the cult of the ancestors, the mos maiorum that had ordered Roman behavior for 4 centuries, was being demolished a brick at a time, and a new cult was being raised in the gap. A man whose dignitas could be dismantled at a dinner had no dignitas. He had the emperor's tolerance, which was a different and weaker substance, renewable each morning at the discretion of the god and withdrawn without notice or appeal. A house whose women could be requisitioned for the imperial cult was not a domus. It was a warehouse. This was the new Rome. This was what he was constructing, while the Senate sat in its chamber and voted yes. The Senate was, by this point, an instrument that played only one note. The consuls of AD 39, Gnaeus Domitius Afer and Aulus Didius Gallus, had each been raised to the office in unusual circumstances. Afer was the orator who had survived Caligula's earlier displeasure by declaring he feared the emperor's eloquence more than his power. Gallus owed his elevation to a financial transaction the records did not preserve. Beneath them sat the praetors and the quaestors and the rank of senators whose families had once spoken in the Forum and whose grandsons would, within a single lifetime, hold no public function except to applaud at the right moments. While he was rebuilding the Senate into a chorus, he also needed a miracle. In the summer of AD 39, on the Bay of Naples, between the ports of Baiae and Puteoli, he built one. The bay was 3.5 miles across at the point he chose. He ordered every available cargo ship in the western Mediterranean requisitioned and lashed together gunwale to gunwale to make a floating road across open water. Suetonius gives the figure. The grain transports of Ostia were drafted into the project. The Annona, the public grain dole that fed 200,000 Roman citizens monthly, ran short for weeks. Citizens went hungry in the insulae of the Subura and the Aventine. Caligula did not adjust the plan. Hunger was a mortal problem. He was demonstrating something on a different scale. When the bridge was complete, the engineers spread earth and gravel across the joined decks to mimic the surface of a Roman road. They built rest stations at intervals. They built a triumphal arch on one of the central platforms. They strung the ships with lamps, so that at night the bay glowed in a single continuous line from coast to coast. He dressed for it. He put on the breastplate of Alexander the Great, removed from Alexander's mausoleum in Alexandria by his order, and shipped to Italy on a warship under armed escort. The breastplate, according to the Alexandrian historians, was the same one Alexander had worn at Issus in 333 BC against the army of Darius III. Over it, Caligula wore a cloak of purple silk imported from China through Parthian intermediaries along the route that crossed the Iranian plateau and was paid for in Roman gold. On his head, he placed a crown of oak leaves, the corona civica, the highest civilian honor Rome could award, traditionally given to a soldier who had saved the life of a fellow citizen in battle. He mounted Incitatus and rode westward across the surface of the sea. The next day, he rode back. This time he wore the gold and scarlet of a Roman triumph, the toga picta and the tunica palmata, the dress of a general returning with a conquered kingdom in chains behind him. He scattered coins into the water as he crossed, paying tribute to the sea he had just defeated. Behind him came a procession of chariots, infantry, prisoners staged for the occasion, and a young Parthian prince named Darius, son of King Artabanus II, who had been sent to Rome as a diplomatic hostage at the conclusion of negotiations on the Euphrates, and who was now riding in costume across a bridge of stolen grain ships to honor the divinity of his host. Strip away the costume. The bay was sacred to Neptune. The Sibyl of Cumae, whose cave was cut into the volcanic cliffs only a few miles up the coast, and whose oracle had been consulted by Roman magistrates since the time of the kings, had reportedly told Tiberius decades earlier, through the astrologer Thrasyllus, who served Tiberius on Capri, that Gaius had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Gulf of Baiae. Caligula had heard the line. He had remembered it. By building the bridge and crossing it, he was answering a dead prophet on her own terms. The forecast that had ruled out his reign had now been refuted by his hooves. He had walked on the sea. He had bent water into a road. Neptune had been overruled in his own dining room. The armor of Alexander was not theater. It was inheritance. Alexander had been declared the son of Zeus Ammon at the oracle of Siwa in the Libyan desert in 331 BC. Wearing his breastplate, Caligula was not imitating a hero. He was claiming the line. Divinity passed from father to son, conqueror to conqueror, through the metal of a chest plate that had taken arrows at Issus and Gaugamela. He wore the same armor north next. The campaign of AD 39 and AD 40 toward Germania and Britain is one of the most disputed episodes in his reign. The official version sent home to the Senate spoke of legions hardened on the Rhine and an invasion fleet preparing for Britain. What Cassius Dio and Suetonius actually preserve, with the careful prose of men who could hardly believe their own sources, was something different. There were Germanic tribesmen captured on the far bank of the Rhine. Some had been captured genuinely. Others, the sources note, were Germans from his own bodyguard, the Germani Corporis Custodes, sent across the river and then taken again for the cameras of the triumph. They were drilled in their lines. They were dressed in barbarian costume. They were paid an extra wage for the performance. The veterans of the Rhine legions saw what they were seeing. They kept their mouths closed. They had served Tiberius. They knew the price of speech. There was a secondary scandal during the German campaign. The legate of Upper Germany was Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Gaetulicus, a senator whose family had governed the Rhine legions for a generation, and whose troops he held in unusual personal loyalty. Caligula had Gaetulicus killed in the autumn of AD 39 accused of conspiracy, along with his son-in-law Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, who had once been Caligula's lover and Drusilla's husband. The bodies were sent back to Rome. Lepidus's 3 sisters, Caligula's own surviving sisters Agrippina the Younger and Julia Livilla, were charged with adultery and treason. Agrippina was forced to carry the urn containing Lepidus's ashes by hand from the Rhine to Rome on foot, the way her mother Agrippina the Elder had once carried the ashes of Germanicus back from Antioch 20 years before. The parallel was deliberate. The cruelty was the point. Then came the beach. By autumn of AD 40, the army stood at the shore of the English Channel near what is now Boulogne-sur-Mer, then called Gezoriacum. They had marched through cold rain across Gaul on a campaign with no objective they had been told about. They were 4 legions, perhaps 20,000 men, the most experienced soldiers in the Western world. Among them were veterans of the German wars under Germanicus himself, men who had been at Edistaviso in AD 16, men who had buried the bones of the legions of Varus in the Teutoburg forest. They stood in formation on the wet sand. The channel ran gray in front of them. Britain lay somewhere in the mist, on the far side. They had their pilum. They had their gladius. They were waiting for the order to board the transports they could see drawn up behind them. Caligula gave the order. He ordered the army to attack the sea. The artillery officers received the command first. They wheeled the ballistae and the onagers, the wooden torsion engines hauled across Gaul on ox carts at enormous expense, into position above the tide line. They cranked the ropes. They loosed iron-tipped bolts, and stone shot into the breaking surf. The bolts hissed into the foam and vanished. The infantry was ordered forward at a walking pace into the water, with javelins raised. The water came to their knees, then their thighs. The cold of the North Sea in October ran up the iron of their armor and into their joints. They threw the javelins into the next incoming wave. Then the order changed. The signal officer relayed it down the line on the cornu, the curved bronze horn whose notes the soldiers had been trained from the first day of service to obey without thinking. Every soldier was to fill his helmet with seashells. 20,000 legionaries bent down on a beach in Gaul and picked through the wet sand. They filled their galei. They emptied them into wagons. The wagons rolled south across Europe at the pace of an army baggage train, escorted by cavalry. The shells were declared the spolia of a victory over Ocean himself, the spoils of a Roman triumph over a primordial god. They would be displayed in Rome at the celebration of the conquest. Caligula also ordered the construction of a tall lighthouse on that beach to commemorate the victory, the Tour d'Ordre at Boulogne, that would still be standing 14 centuries later, lit each night as a monument to a battle in which no enemy had ever appeared. The legions obeyed. They had just been used as the muscle of a god's argument with another god over jurisdiction at the waterline. Their identity as the deadliest professional force on earth was beside the point. A god's army gathers what the god asks it to gather. The donative he had promised them at the start of the campaign, the bonus payment expected by Roman troops at the conclusion of a major operation, he reduced to 100 sesterces per man. The legionaries muttered in their tents that night. Caligula, hearing of it, told them to take what was given and be grateful. Suetonius preserves his line. He told them they had grown rich enough off him already, and if anyone in those ranks still harbored a doubt about what they were now serving, the horse settled it. Incitatus was a Spanish racing stallion of the Greens, one of the 4 circus factions whose rivalries in the Circus Maximus could provoke riots that killed scores of citizens in a single afternoon. Cassius Dio and Suetonius both record his life in the kind of bewildered detail historians use when they suspect the audience will not believe them. The horse had a stable of marble built on the Palatine. His manger was carved from a single piece of ivory. His drinking trough was gold. His blanket was Tyrian purple, the same dye that draped the diners on the Palatine. He wore a collar set with gemstones around the neck of a horse. He had 18 household slaves attending to him. He had bodyguards. Soldiers were detailed to clear his street the day before he was to be exercised, to spare him the noise of the city. He received invitations to dine, and his guests, senators, prefects, equestrian financiers, arrived at his stall and reclined on couches to eat oats and barley in his honor, while the emperor watched them and said nothing. He was made a priest of the imperial cult. He held a salary from the public purse. He was provided with a mare named Penelope as his official wife. And then Caligula announced his intention to make Incitatus consul. Historians have argued the meaning of this for 2,000 years. Some read it as a savage joke aimed at the consulship. If a horse could discharge the office had been a fiction long before the horse was nominated. Others take the sources at their word. The distinction may be smaller than the argument. Whether he meant it as satire or as policy, the effect on the men who heard it landed in the same place. A consul who was a horse meant that every man who had held that office, every genes that had built its name around the chair for half a millennium since the expulsion of the kings in 509 BC, occupied a rank that could be filled by an animal. The horse's worth came from the emperor's affection. The consul's worth came from the emperor's permission. The two were now formally interchangeable. The god had said so at the morning audience. The senators who heard the news went home and sat in their atria, past the wax masks of the ancestors, and considered their options. The options were thin. The god was 28 years old. He was in good health. He had the 9 Praetorian cohorts at the gates of the palace, the German bodyguard inside it, and 25 legions on the frontiers. He had spent 4 years demonstrating that no precedent, no friendship, and no human instinct restrained him. But in the rented quarters of one Praetorian officer, the calculation was running on a different track. Before we get to the knife in the corridor, take a moment to look down at the screen. The book that made this investigation possible is sitting on the shelf right now, attached to this video. It is a monolithic archive of the imperial world, the kind of work that does not just describe what happened in those palaces and on that beach, but excavates the why beneath each act. It was the foundation under every scene you have just watched. Reading it is the difference between knowing the outline of this history and walking inside it. Beside it on that shelf, you will find other relics of Rome. Pieces I suspect will catch you by surprise. Open the shop with the button on your screen and look. Browse while I keep speaking. Some shelves are worth lingering on, and this is one of them. The officer's name was Cassius Chaerea. He was a tribune of the Praetorian Guard, a veteran of the Rhine. He had served under Germanicus himself, Caligula's own father, 25 years earlier in the year AD 14. Tacitus mentions him in the Annals as one of the few officers who had held discipline during the mutiny of the Rhine legions in that year, walking through a camp at night where men were murdering their centurions with tent pegs and bringing his cohort back into order with nothing but his voice and the flat of his sword. He had cut his way out of a mob of his own soldiers. He had earned scars across his hands and his shins that he could still trace with his fingers in the dark. He was a hard soldier. He commanded men. He held the daily watchword detail at the palace gate. He also possessed, by the chance of his vocal cords, a voice that rode a little higher than the chest rumble Romans expected from a man of his record. It was a small thing. Suetonius mentions it without judgment. Under any other emperor, it would never have surfaced. Caligula surfaced it every morning. The watchword was the daily password that every Praetorian officer collected from the emperor at dawn to coordinate the guard. The emperor delivered it in person, standing in the colonnade outside the imperial apartments, the senior officers passing in single file to receive their word and salute. Caligula made a game of it for Hieraea. He gave him the names of things tied to femininity, to the genitals, to obscenity: Priapus, Venus. Once, according to Josephus, who preserves the longest account of Chaerea's part in what came next, the word was simply kiss, and Caligula offered his hand for the salute, with the middle finger extended in the obscene gesture the Romans called the digitus imputicus, pressed against the officer's lips, while the junior tribunes behind him watched, and did not laugh because laughter at the wrong moment was death. This was not a one-day cruelty. It was a daily liturgy. He understood what he was doing. A god who has stripped senators of their wives, sent legions to gather shells, made a horse a priest, and ordered his own golden statue installed in the holiest room of a foreign temple, has run out of large gestures for ordinary mornings. The maintenance of divinity in the slow hours had to be done through small humiliations delivered face to face, witnessed by men who carried the story outward like rings of water from a dropped stone. Every officer at the dawn audience understood the message. No one was beneath the god's contempt. No record of service, no scar from the Rhine, no decoration pinned to the breastplate exempted you. Chaerea heard it. He stood at attention. He saluted. He took the watchword and walked it out to his men. He was not alone. Beside him in the guard stood another tribune, Cornelius Sabinus, whose grievances Josephus does not specify, but whose name appears in every account of what was coming. In the senatorial benches sat Annius Vinicianus, a man whose family had been touched by the conspiracy of Lepidus, and who knew his own name was already inked on some list inside the palace. Behind them moved Callistus, one of the emperor's most trusted freedmen, an ex-slave who had risen to control the imperial correspondence and who had begun, in the small hours of his own nights, to count the years he had left, if the god he served continued to age. The men did not yet meet as a group. They moved in pairs, they spoke in courtyards, they watched the schedule of the upcoming Palatine Games, the festival in honor of the deified Augustus held each January from the 17th to the 24th, staged in a wooden theater erected for the occasion just outside the imperial apartments. They noted the route the emperor would walk between the theater and the bath. They timed the moment he would be alone, between two rooms, in a narrow underground passage where the Germani corporis custodes, the Germans of the bodyguard, who spoke only their own language and obeyed only their captain, would be out of earshot. The god had made the mistake gods often make when they build their religions out of fear. He had confused the silence of the humiliated with the consent of the humiliated. They were not consenting. They were measuring the corridor. They were counting the steps from the dressing room behind the stage to the cryptoporticus that ran beneath the palace. They were noting which guards would be on which post on which afternoon during the Palatine Games in January. They were sharpening a short legionary gladius and a curved Greek dagger, 2 blades for 2 hands, because they had decided that one blade alone might not be enough to finish a god before the bodyguard came running. The date they had chosen was the 24th of January, AD 41, the last day of the festival. It was 8 weeks away. The Palatine Games opened each January in the small wooden theater Augustus had built against the southern wall of the imperial residence. They had been instituted by Livia in AD 14 after her husband's death and were celebrated every year from the 17th to the 24th of January in honor of the deified Augustus. 8 days of plays, mime, recitations, choral performances, and chariot displays staged for an audience that was, in practical terms, the court. The actors looked into the front row and saw the man who could end their lives between scenes. The man in the front row looked at the stage and saw an extension of his own household. The corridors that linked the dressing rooms to the imperial apartments ran beneath the hillside, cut directly into the volcanic tufa of the Palatine, lit by oil lamps in iron brackets, and unventilated enough that the smell of burning olive oil collected in the curves of the ceiling and stayed there for hours. The plaster on the walls had been painted 20 years earlier in the style of the Second Pompeian school, faded reds and ochres in geometric borders, and was beginning to flake near the floor, where the damp of the hill pushed through the stone. Cassius Chaerea had walked those corridors every working day for a decade. He could find the turns in the dark. The conspiracy that gathered around him stayed small on purpose. A wider circle meant a wider chance of betrayal, and betrayal in this matter meant the kind of death the emperor had been refining as a personal art form for 4 years. The operational corps was 3 men: Chaerea, the tribune, Cornelius Sabinus, a third Praetorian officer named Papinius. Around them, knowing but not striking, stood a wider ring: the senator Annius Vinicianus, who had survived the purge of Lepidus and Gaetulicus in AD 39 only by accident of timing and knew his name was inked on the next list. The freedman Callistus, who controlled the imperial correspondence and had begun, in his own apartments on the Lower Palatine, to draft the bureaucratic instruments for whoever came after. Possibly Marcus Aracinus Clemens, one of the 2 Praetorian prefects, whose later promotion under Claudius reads in the record like the payment of a debt. The other prefect, Marcus Lucius Geta, was not on the inside but was kept distracted on the morning of the strike by an inspection of the watch rosters at the Castra Praetoria, 3 miles across the city. What this group understood, and what every previous opponent of Caligula had failed to grasp, was that politics had stopped being a usable instrument. The Senate could not vote him out. The provinces could not refuse him. The legions had picked seashells when he asked them to. Public opinion in Rome was managed by the grain dole, the congiaria, and the games. The grain dole and the games were paid for with the estates of the men he was killing. Every conventional mechanism by which Roman elites had managed their differences since the time of Sulla had been folded into a single throat that opened only when the god decided to speak. The only mechanism left was a short iron blade in a narrow corridor. They picked the date with care. The 24th of January, AD 41, the 8th and final day of the festival. The day Caligula was expected to leave the theater at midday, walk back through the underground crypta to his private apartments to bathe and eat, and then return for the afternoon performances. The route was fixed by habit. The escort would be light because the route was internal. The Germani Corporis Custodes, the squad of Batavian and Chattan warriors who answered only to the emperor and would die for him without thinking, were assigned to the perimeter of the theater, not the underground passage. They had been recruited personally by Augustus a generation earlier and then re-recruited under Caligula with a doubled stipend, men whose own villages were 1,000 miles away and whose loyalty had nothing in it of Rome. In the corridor itself, for perhaps 60 seconds, the god would be guarded by men whose blades the conspirators themselves carried. The morning of the 24th, Josephus writes, Caligula was in unusually good humor. He had hesitated about attending at all. His digestion was bad, the residue of a heavy supper the night before, during which he had laughed about a play that depicted a man returning from the dead. He attended the dawn sacrifice. The Flamen Palatualis, who served the obscure tutelary divinity of the Palatine itself, struck the bull with the mallet. The throat opened cleanly. The haruspices read, "the liver." The signs, the priests reported, were excellent. A drop of the animal's blood splashed up onto Caligula's white toga as he stood at the altar. He looked at the stain and laughed, and said it was Asiaticus's blood, gesturing at the senator Valerius Asiaticus, who was standing 3 paces away. The joke landed wrong. Asiaticus would be among the men shouting from the theater balcony before nightfall that he wished he had been the one to kill him. Caligula took his seat in the front row. Around him on the curved wooden benches sat the men of his court. His uncle Claudius, in the seat reserved for the closest male relative, Marcus Vinicius, husband of his sister Julia Livilla, and a man already under suspicion for things he had not yet done, the consul Gnaeus Sentius Saturninus, the senator Pomponius Secundus, a tragedian whose own plays Caligula had once praised and then quietly suppressed, Nestor, the Spanish dancer the emperor kept under personal patronage, performed a pantomime of Cinyras and Myrrha, the Greek myth in which a father sleeps with his own daughter and is killed for it. The choice of subject was either oblivious or pointed. The actors used stage blood mixed with red ochre and saffron, and at the climax of the performance, the floor of the stage was soaked with it. Suetonius lingers on this detail. The fluid ran down the boards and dripped onto Caligula's sandaled feet in the front row. He looked at his feet. He laughed. A boy of the imperial household, the son of a senator from Asia Minor named Asclepiodotus, had been brought into the front row to recite a Homeric passage during the midday interval. He was perhaps 12 years old, fair-haired, nervous, in a clean white tunic. He stood beside the emperor's seat throughout the morning. The boy was alive at noon. He would not be alive by the afternoon. Caligula almost did not leave at the break. He almost stayed in his seat and had food brought in. Senators near him noticed he was hesitating. Aspranus, an older man, leaned over and urged him to step out and bathe before the afternoon performances. The advice was given in good faith. It killed Aspranus inside the hour. Caligula stood. He gathered his attendants. He took the boy Asclepiodotus by the hand. He turned toward the corridor. The crypta beneath the Palatine has been partially excavated in the modern era and runs east to west under the southern flank of the hill. A vaulted passage perhaps 2 meters wide and 2.5 high, the walls plastered in the same fading second style as the rest of the lower palace. Halfway along its length, in AD 41, it widened slightly where a service passage branched off toward the slave kitchens. The widening, this single accident of architecture, is where the men were waiting. The lamp nearest that spot had been left unlit. The conspirators had arranged it the previous evening with a slave from the lampkeeper's staff, a Greek named Euodus, who was never identified in the official record, but whose name surfaces in a single line of Cassius Dio. Caligula entered the corridor. His retinue was 4, 2 attendants, a litter-bearer named Memmius, and the boy. The footsteps echoed off the curved ceiling. The smell of the lamp oil was thick. The temperature dropped 20 degrees from the open colonnade above. Chaerea reached him first. Josephus, whose account is the most detailed because his patron Agrippa the Reader was on the Palatine that day and gave him the story directly, records the exchange. Chaerea asked for the watchword. Caligula, amused, gave him one of the obscene words he had been using for months. Some sources record it as Jupiter, with the implication that Chaerea would carry the joke back to his subordinates. Some give Venus. Whatever the word was, it was the last one he gave. Chaerea's response was the blade. He drew it from beneath his cloak and brought it down. The accounts disagree on where the cut landed. Suetonius says between the shoulder blades, the stroke of a man striking from behind. Josephus places the wound on the neck, between the jaw and the collarbone, the kind of cut a soldier delivers when he is facing the target and wants to open the great vessel under the ear. Cassius Dio splits the difference and gives both. What they agree on is the result. The blow did not kill him. It cut him deep enough to put him on his knees. He bled in a long ribbon down the front of his white tunic, the stain spreading faster than the eye could follow. He did not fall. He shouted. The Latin the sources preserve is short. Etiam vivo. I am still alive. 4 words. The theology of his entire reign compressed into a phrase. He had built a religion whose central claim was that the rules of mortal flesh did not bind him. He had received the proof of the opposite in the form of a wound, and his first reaction was to deny it out loud, in front of the witnesses, as if the assertion alone could amend the fact. It could not. Sabinus stepped in next. Then Papinius. Then the centurion Aquila, whom Suetonius credits with the killing stroke, a downward thrust through the chest. A 5th man, a tribune named Iulius Lupus, finished any movement that remained. The blades came down in series. The ancient sources place the wound count at 30, which has the shape of a literary number rather than a forensic one, but the principle was unanimous. They were thorough. They had agreed in advance that anything less than thorough would invite the kind of reprisal the German bodyguard was about to demonstrate. Several of them, Josephus records, slashed at the corpse after it had stopped moving. One bit into the flesh, in the old Etruscan gesture of devouring a defeated enemy. The Latin chronicle of the act does not preserve who. The boy Asclepiodotus stood in the corner of the antechamber and did not move. The litter-bearer Memmius bolted back toward the theater. One of the attendants tried to drag the body away and was cut down beside it. When the conspirators were finished, the man who had ridden Alexander's breastplate across a sea was a heap on the painted floor of a service corridor. And the corridor was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet immediately after large violence. Every small sound very clear. The dripping of his blood between the flagstones. The wheeze of one of the wounded attendants. The breathing of the men still standing. For a moment, no one above ground in Rome knew the empire had changed hands. Then a slave ran. The Germani Corporis Custodes were the first to hear. They were stationed at the 4 entrances of the theater under the command of a captain named Sabinus, not the conspirator, a different man, a Batavian whose Roman name had been imposed on him at recruitment, and whose original name no source preserved. Memmius reached him. The German captain understood Latin badly, and the news quickly. He drew his spatha, the long sword they carried instead of the shorter Roman gladius, and he did what men do when the single point of meaning in their professional lives has just been removed. They began to kill. They killed Asprenas first, the senator who had urged Caligula to take the midday break. He was caught in the colonnade outside the theater, still holding a cup of wine. They killed Norbanus Balbus, who was walking back toward his litter. They killed Antaius, whose father Caligula had executed 3 years earlier and who had attended the festival specifically to be seen doing his duty. Tacitus, in a fragment preserved in a later author, mentions a 4th man, the equestrian Cluvius Rufus, who escaped only by lying flat among the dead until the Germans had passed. The killing was not investigation. It was not pursuit of the actual conspirators. It was diffuse, expanding violence, the grief of men whose grief had only one shape, and the shape was a blade. In the theater itself, the audience did not yet know. The performance on stage had continued. A second mime had begun, a piece on the death of Pyrrhus at Argos, in which the title character is killed by a roof tile thrown by a woman. A herald entered from the wings with news of the emperor's assassination. The audience refused to believe it, suspecting a test. They had been tested before. Caligula had once announced his own death to gauge the response of the senators present, and then executed 3 men who had smiled. The herald repeated it. The audience sat in silence. Senators who tried to leave were turned back at the doors by the Germans, who were checking faces for guilt and finding it everywhere. The historian Josephus, writing from family memory, describes the next half hour as a closed room filling with smoke and no exit. Somewhere in the imperial apartments, the news reached Caligula's wife. Her name was Milonia Caesonia. She had married him in late AD 39 or early AD 40, already pregnant with their daughter, already past the age at which Roman aristocratic women were considered candidates for an emperor's bed. Suetonius is unkind to her. He calls her neither beautiful nor young and lingers on the suggestion that Caligula's attachment to her ran through a love filter she had given him, the same filter, the rumor insisted, that had also disordered his mind. The historian Pliny the Elder, writing a generation later, repeats the filter story and adds the detail that it contained hippomenes, a substance taken from the forehead of a newborn foal. The sources are men. The sources find her less interesting than the horse. What is clear is that she did not run. She was found in her apartment on the upper floor of the palace, in a room that overlooked the gardens of Tiberius. She was holding the baby. The soldier sent to finish her, a centurion named Iulius Lupus, the same man who had been in the corridor, had been dispatched specifically to close the dynastic line. Caesonia is reported to have offered her throat to him without speaking, in the manner of a Roman noblewoman who has decided that the only remaining choice is the manner of her exit. Lupus cut it. Her blood, according to Josephus, ran down the front of the same dress in which she had received the news. The child was harder. Julia Drusilla was a few months past her first birthday. She had been named for the dead sister Caligula had manufactured into a goddess. She was the only surviving child of the emperor and the only living link to the dynastic line that ran from Augustus through Germanicus through Caligula. The conspirators had agreed, in advance, that she could not be left alive. A surviving Julio-Claudian infant was a future civil war. Suetonius records what was done to her in a single short sentence, and then moves to the next event. Lupus carried her to a wall and dashed her against the masonry. Josephus adds that she fought him. She had inherited, the historian writes, something of her father's temper. She had bitten his fingers and scratched at his face before she was killed. She was the last person killed that afternoon. She had been named for the first god her father had ever invented, and she died the way the gods her father had invented died, by the hand of a Roman professional with a job to finish before sundown. The palace went quiet by the late afternoon. The Praetorian command, scrambling to assert control before the Germans burned the Palatine down around them, ordered the bodyguard back to their quarters in the Castra Germanorum. The body of Caligula was carried, half-wrapped in a hastily seized curtain, to the gardens of the Lamian family on the Esquiline. There it was, half-burned on an improvised pyre, and the bones interred without ceremony. The 2 surviving sisters, Agrippina and Julia Livilla, recalled from exile by the Senate within 48 hours, would later disinter the bones and give them proper burial in the mausoleum of Augustus on the Campus Martius. Suetonius records that before the bones were exhumed, the gardens had been haunted at night by figures the servants refused to describe. The senators who had survived the corridor and the colonnade gathered in the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, the old religious heart of the Republic, the place Romans went when they needed to remember who they had been before the Caesars. They convened the Senate in emergency session. The chamber of the Curia in the Forum was avoided as too exposed. They met instead in the cella of the temple, beneath the great cult statue of Jupiter, that Vespasian would, in 30 years, rebuild after a fire, and that on this evening still wore the original gold-leaf Tarquinius superbus had applied 5 centuries before. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary debates in Roman history, and one of the least successful. The consul of that year, Gnaeus Sentius Saturninus, delivered a speech that Josephus preserves at unusual length. He called the assembled senators to remember the libertas of their ancestors, the freedom of the Roman people, the constitution of the republic that the Caesars had buried beneath 100 years of dynastic accident. He proposed, on the floor, that they restore the republic, not as a gesture, as a working government. The Caesars had given them 4 principes in a row, and the 4th had made a horse a priest and used the Senate as a chorus. Enough. The vote was real. The intent of at least some participants, Sentius, Venetianus, Valerius Asiaticus, who had stood on a balcony that afternoon and shouted to the crowd that he wished he had killed him himself, was real. The watchword issued by Sentius to the urban cohorts that night was Libertas. It was the first time in 70 years that a Roman magistrate had issued that word as a command. The debate ran into the night. It ran into the next morning. The senators stayed in the temple. Food was brought in by their slaves. The lamps were refilled twice. And while the Senate argued, 3 Praetorians were walking through the empty palace looking for valuables, and one of them, a guardsman named Gratus, noticed a pair of feet sticking out from behind a curtain in a side room off the main corridor. The feet belonged to Tiberius, Claudius, Drusus, Nero, Germanicus. He was 50 years old. He limped, the result of an illness in infancy that some modern physicians have suggested was cerebral palsy. He stammered. He drooled when excited. He had been the household disgrace for 40 years. The embarrassment Antonia had called a half-finished man. The uncle Caligula had kept at court to wear donkey ears at dinner and absorb thrown olive pits. He was a scholar. He had written, by this point in his life, a 20-volume history of the Etruscans, an 8-volume history of Carthage, both in Greek, both now lost. He was hiding behind a curtain in the hope of not being noticed by anyone for long enough to die of natural causes in a corner. Gratus pulled the curtain back. Claudius fell to his knees on the marble and begged for his life. Suetonius preserves the line Gratus is said to have spoken to his fellow guardsman. Hic Germanicus. This is the brother of Germanicus. The guardsman did not kill him. He looked at him and saw the only living adult male of the line of Augustus. The Praetorians carried him in a litter to their camp on the eastern edge of the city, the Castra Praetoria, built by Sejanus in AD 23. They sat him on a chair. They acclaimed him imperator. They each accepted, in the formal terms of the transaction, a payment of 15,000 sesterces, 5 years' wages for a legionary, for the service of their loyalty. This was the first donativum. The practice would recur at every imperial succession for the next 4 centuries, and would, in the centuries to come, become the mechanism by which the army sold the empire to the highest bidder. The most famous later transaction, in AD 193, would see the Praetorians auction the throne to Didius Julianus for 25,000 sesterces per man. The Senate, debating the Republic into its second day, received word that the Praetorians had already named an emperor. The debate ended within the hour. Senators slipped out of the temple in small groups. Sentius removed his consular insignia in the vestibule and went home in a plain toga. Asiaticus crossed the Tiber and waited to see who would survive. Venetianus stayed loyal to his ideals for another 6 months, and then took part in a second conspiracy against Claudius in AD 42, and was forced to kill himself when it failed. The Republic did not return. It would never return. Chaerea was executed within the month. Claudius, however much he owed his throne to the men who had cleared the chair, could not be seen to tolerate the assassins of his predecessor. The precedent was poison. Chaerea went to the block with the dignity of a man who had concluded years earlier that his life was a price he had agreed to pay. He asked, the sources record, that the same blade be used on him that had been used on the emperor. The request was granted. Sabinus refused to wait for the executioner and killed himself in his own quarters. Lupus, who had killed the wife and the child, was given the same end. Papinius escaped pursuit and disappeared from the record. The other conspirators dispersed into the long, quiet, frightened lives of men who had done something necessary and were not allowed to be celebrated for it. The official condemnation of Caligula's memory followed. The Senate decreed damnatio memoriae, though Claudius, careful to avoid offending the soldiers and the common people who had loved his nephew in the early months of his reign, never permitted the decree to be formally promulgated. The condemnation moved through the empire anyway. Statues were pulled down from Britain to Syria. His name was chiseled out of inscriptions in cities he had never visited. The aurae and denarii bearing his face were called in and melted. The metal restruck with the head of his uncle. In some inscriptions, the erasure was so complete that only a negative space remains, a chiseled void in the marble where a name had been. In the temple of the imperial cult at Aphrodisias, the relief of his portrait was simply hacked off the wall, leaving the body of a god with no face. The erasure failed. It failed because what he had done to Rome was not a list of acts that could be unsaid by removing a name from stone. He had demonstrated something about the structure underneath the costume, and the demonstration could not be undemonstrated. The Principate Augustus had spent 40 years dressing in the clothes of the Republic. The careful pretense that the emperor was first citizen, that the Senate retained authority, that the magistracies were real, that Rome was still in some meaningful sense governed by its institutions, was revealed in 4 years to be a single naked fact, wearing 400 years of fabric. The fact was that one man could do anything he wanted to anyone he could reach, and the institutions would help him do it. Augustus had known this and hidden it. Tiberius had known it and retreated to an island rather than expose it. Caligula had taken the fabric off and held it up in front of the Senate, and asked the Senate to admire his work. Every emperor who came after him lived in a room he had emptied. Claudius wore the costume back on with care, restoring the Maestas trials he had suspended, reopening the records he had publicly burned, executing 35 senators and 300 equestrians in his 13-year reign, according to the Count Suetonius preserves. Nero wore it until he tore it off and died in a freedman's villa with a borrowed dagger. Vespasian wore it like a man wearing a tunic, comfortable, unremarkable, professional. The system survived. The system survived for another 4 centuries in the West and 14 in the East. But every senator who walked into the Curia after AD 41 knew what room he was sitting in. He was sitting in the room that had voted yes to a horse. He was sitting in the room that had agreed 8 months in a row that a young woman who had died of fever had ascended into heaven and become every goddess at once. The chairs had memory. The marble had memory. The legions had memory too. The veterans went home from that beach in Gaul carrying seashells, and they passed the story to their sons, and the sons passed it to grandsons who served on the Danube and the Euphrates and in the deserts of Africa. Every Roman soldier of the next 3 generations knew what an order from an emperor could ask of him, because his grandfather had bent down and filled a helmet. This is the residue. This is what damnatio memoriae could not chisel out of the stone. Caligula's legacy is not a lesson about madness. Madness would be easier. Madness is rare and accidental and cannot be planned for, and the consolation of treating him as mad is the implicit suggestion that a stable mind in the same chair would not have done the same things. The implicit suggestion is wrong. The chair did the things. The chair, freed from the costume of constraint by a man willing to wear it without the costume, did exactly what the chair had always been capable of doing. He proved that the machinery of an organized civilization will, under sufficient pressure and the right kind of fear, ratify any theology. It will declare the dead divine. It will fund the building of a road across the sea. It will send its best soldiers to fight the ocean. It will hand its wives across a dinner table without a word. It will vote a horse into the consulship if the alternative is a knock on the door at midnight. The threshold at which institutions break in this direction is not fixed by law. It is fixed by the willingness of the men inside the institution to refuse. And the willingness of the men inside the institution to refuse is not infinite. Until one of them, in the dark of a stone corridor, decides that gods bleed. They do. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, called Caligula, ruled Rome for 3 years, 10 months, and 8 days. He was 28 years old when Cassius Chaerea opened him from the shoulder down. His wife was Milonia Caesonia. His daughter was Julia Drusilla. His horse was Incitatus. The colossus prepared for the Temple of Jerusalem never sailed. The statue was on the docks at Sidon, in crates lined with straw, when the courier from Rome arrived with news of his death. The order to ship it was rescinded by Claudius within the week. The Holy of Holies remained empty. The God who had tried to evict the God of Abraham died in a corridor under a theater, in his own blood, calling out that he was still alive, while the proof of the opposite slid down the front of his tunic. Some gods die before they can finish their miracles. Most do. Thank you for staying with this story to the corridor and past it. If something in this hour landed, a name you will not forget, a sentence that ran cold down the back of your neck, a hard understanding of how power actually works when nothing holds it back, pass it forward. Send it to someone who reads history the way you do. Leave a comment with the moment that struck you hardest. Tell us the name from this story that will stay with you. Drop the like. Subscribe if you have not yet. The algorithm answers to those signals, and those signals are how this kind of work keeps reaching the people who need it. You have just watched another premium documentary by Romanus, your home of the Roman Empire, on YouTube. The next investigation is already waiting for you on screen. Another corridor. Another emperor who learned, too late, that the men around him could still bleed him back. Click it. Rome is not finished with you yet.